Something unusual is happening right now, and most people will never notice it. While the world moves through another ordinary day, scrolling, working, worrying about the same problems it worried about yesterday, the sky above is quietly aligning in a way that has occurred only a handful of times in recent memory. The April 2026 lunar alignment. On April 17th, 2026 has reached its peak, and whether someone believes in cosmic symbolism or simply views the moon as another object in space, the moment still carries a powerful psychological truth. Rare moments have a strange ability to wake us up. They interrupt routine. They disrupt autopilot. And sometimes they create the exact opening needed to question the invisible scripts running inside the mind. Right now, many people are looking up at the moon and seeing nothing more than a bright circle of reflected sunlight. But there is another way to look at this moment. Not as a mystical portal or a magical shortcut, but as a rare psychological checkpoint. A pause in the usual rhythm of life where awareness becomes sharper and the distance between your conscious thinking and your deeper patterns suddenly becomes easier to observe. Because here is the uncomfortable reality that very few people ever stop to consider. Most of what shapes your life today was not chosen today. It was programmed years ago through repeated experiences, emotional conditioning, and the silent beliefs you absorbed about what is possible, what you deserve, and how the world works. These internal instructions become so familiar that they operate like background software. They guide decisions, influence reactions, and quietly shape the direction of your life without asking for permission. Over time, those patterns form something like an internal script, a set of expectations about how life unfolds. And the strange part is that even when those scripts stop serving you, they often continue running simply because they are familiar. That is why moments like this alignment can feel so strangely powerful. Not because the moon is rewriting your brain, but because moments of collective attention and reflection create the perfect opportunity to interrupt the old story. When you pause long enough to observe your inner patterns, you begin to realize something extraordinary. The script that once shaped your life is not permanent. It is editable, and the awareness that allows you to edit it can appear in a single moment of clarity. If you have ever experienced a moment where an old belief suddenly lost its power, where a fear you carried for years suddenly seemed smaller, or where a new possibility appeared that you had never considered before, then you already understand the kind of shift we are talking about. Moments like these rarely arrive with fireworks. They arrive quietly, disguised as insight, and yet they can change the direction of a life. That is why today's conversation matters. Not because the moon demands anything from you, but because this moment offers a powerful invitation to step out of unconscious repetition and into conscious choice. Before we go any further, welcome to the Inner Code, a space where we explore the deeper patterns shaping the way we think, perceive, and respond to reality. If these ideas resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring these conversations together. Every new subscriber helps this channel grow and gives us the momentum to keep producing thoughtful content like this. Because the real question we will explore today is simple, but it carries enormous implications. If the script running inside your mind has been quietly shaping your life until now, what might change if you became aware enough to rewrite it? And once you begin to recognize that your inner script can be rewritten, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Why does this moment feel different from all the others you have lived through and forgotten? What makes this particular alignment feel so charged, so psychologically alive, so difficult to dismiss as just another date on the calendar? The answer is not found only in the sky above you, but in the strange relationship between rare outer events and the inner states they awaken in human beings. Because certain moments do not merely pass through history, they interrupt it. They gather attention. They pull people out of routine. They create a pause in the ordinary momentum of life, and inside that pause, something subtle begins to happen. The mind becomes more observant. Emotional patterns that usually stay buried start rising closer to the surface. Thoughts you normally outrun become harder to ignore. It is as if the noise of daily life lowers just enough for you to hear what has been quietly shaping you all along. That is why this alignment matters now. Not because it forces change upon you, but because it creates a rare psychological opening in which change becomes easier to notice, easier to choose, and harder to postpone. Most people think transformation arrives like lightning, dramatic and unmistakable. But real transformation often begins in a quieter way. It begins when the familiar structure of your inner world no longer feels as solid as it used to. When the fears that once controlled you begin to look more like patterns than truths. When the emotional habits you carried for years begin to reveal themselves not as identity, but as repetition. In a moment like this, what was once invisible becomes visible. And once something becomes visible, it can no longer govern you in the same unconscious way. That is the deeper significance of a rare alignment. It does not hand you a new life. It reveals the architecture of the life you are already living. For many people, these kinds of moments create a heightened state of reflection where the boundary between conscious intention and unconscious habit feels thinner than usual. Old beliefs rise. Memories return. Hidden resistance becomes easier to detect. You may notice recurring fears around love, money, trust, or self-worth surfacing with unusual intensity, not because you are moving backward, but because what has been buried is becoming available for revision. The timing matters because when the mind is interrupted from its usual rhythm, it becomes more open to reorganization. This is why major turning points in life are often preceded by discomfort, emotional restlessness, or a strange sense that something inside you is being rearranged. The old internal structure begins to loosen before the new one takes shape. And if you understand that process, you stop panicking when the old script starts shaking. You realize the shaking is not failure. It is exposure. It is the moment the hidden code rises high enough to finally be seen. That is why this is not just a date to observe, but a moment to use. If you move through it unconsciously, it becomes another interesting event that came and went. But if you meet it with awareness, it becomes a mirror, and that mirror can show you exactly which internal patterns are still directing your choices from the shadows. This is where the meaning of timing becomes personal, because the value of a rare moment is never only in the event itself. Its value is in your willingness to become fully present while it is happening, to stop distracting yourself, to stop postponing the inner work, to stop pretending the patterns running your life will somehow dissolve on their own. Moments like this matter because they confront you with a choice. Remain loyal to the script that built your current reality, or become conscious enough to begin writing a new one. And for the first time in a long time, that choice may feel closer than ever. And once you see that certain moments can expose the script, the next revelation becomes even more unsettling. The script itself has been running far longer than you think. Most people imagine their life is being shaped mainly by the decisions they make in the present, by what they say they want, by the goals they consciously choose, by the effort they believe they are putting in. But beneath that surface layer, there is another architecture quietly operating with far more influence than most people ever realize. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply repeats. It lives in your automatic reactions, in the emotional conclusions you formed years ago, in the way your body tightens before your mind even understands why, in the assumptions you make so quickly you mistake them for truth. This is the hidden neural code running your life. It is the collection of old instructions written through repetition, memory, fear, adaptation, and survival. And because it was formed gradually, it rarely feels like programming. It feels like personality. It feels like instinct. It feels like reality. That is what makes it so powerful. A person does not wake up one morning and consciously decide to fear intimacy, expect rejection, distrust abundance, or brace for disappointment. These patterns are usually built in quieter ways. A few painful moments become a general belief. A season of instability becomes a lifelong expectation. A childhood wound becomes an adult identity. Over time, the brain learns efficiency. It stops asking whether an old conclusion is still true and begins treating it as a command. Then the nervous system joins in. The body starts preparing for familiar pain before any actual threat appears. The heart closes before love has a chance to arrive. The mind predicts loss before opportunity can fully unfold. And because these reactions happen so quickly, people often assume they are simply being realistic, when in truth they are reenacting code written by an earlier version of themselves. This is why so many lives begin to resemble loops. The same relationship dynamics, the same money fears, the same pattern of hesitation right before growth, the same internal shrinking whenever something meaningful gets too close. On the outside, it looks like coincidence. On the inside, it is often repetition. Not because a person is broken, but because their system is running instructions that were never consciously updated. And what makes this even more difficult to recognize is that these patterns can survive even after someone has intellectually outgrown them. A person may consciously believe they deserve more, yet still feel tension when more begins to arrive. They may say they are ready for change, yet feel a strange pull back toward what is familiar. They may desire a new life while emotionally remaining loyal to an old one. That tension is not weakness. It is evidence that deeper code is still active. The mind may be speaking in the language of possibility while the body is still fluent in the language of protection. And until those two layers are brought into awareness together, people keep trying to solve a deeper problem with surface-level effort. They try to think their way out of a pattern their body still trusts. They try to affirm over a wound they have never really met. They try to create a future their nervous system still reads as unsafe. This is why awareness matters so much at this stage of the journey. Because once you begin to recognize the hidden code, you stop taking every automatic reaction at face value. You become more curious about what rises inside you. You start asking better questions. Why does this specific situation trigger me so quickly? Why does my body contract when something good approaches? Why do I expect loss before anything has been lost? Those questions are not signs of confusion. They are the beginning of liberation. Because the moment you realize an old pattern is running, you are no longer completely inside it. You are beginning to observe it. And the moment observation enters, the code loses some of its invisibility. It becomes something you can study rather than something that must continue controlling you. That is the deeper truth hidden underneath so many human struggles. People are not always fighting their present circumstances. Very often, they are living inside instructions written by a former emotional self who was only trying to survive. And if you can see that clearly, then you can begin to understand why rewriting your life never starts with forcing reality. It starts with identifying the code that has been quietly shaping it from within. And once you reach the point where the deeper script becomes accessible, the next task is no longer abstract at all. It becomes painfully personal. Because before anything new can be written, something old has to be recognized with enough honesty to be released. This is where many people hesitate. They say they want change, but what they really want is a better future without the discomfort of meeting the patterns that built the present. They want a new reality while remaining emotionally untouched by the old one. But that is not how real transformation works. The patterns that must be deleted rarely arrive looking dramatic or obvious. More often, they appear in the familiar thoughts you barely notice anymore, the reactions that seem justified in the moment, the emotional contractions you have carried for so long that they feel like part of your identity. They live in the silent assumptions underneath your choices. They appear in the part of you that expects disappointment before good things fully arrive. In the reflex that mistrusts peace because chaos feels more familiar. In the instinct to pull away from connection the moment it begins to matter. In the voice that treats self-protection as wisdom even when it is quietly becoming self-sabotage. These are not random flaws. They are old survival codes still trying to manage a life that is asking to grow beyond them. That is why this stage requires more than insight. It requires courage. Because identifying what must be deleted means you have to stop romanticizing the patterns that keep you stuck simply because they once kept you safe. You have to become honest about the cost of carrying outdated code. Some patterns will reveal themselves as fear dressed up as caution. Some will look like perfectionism, but underneath will be the terror of being seen imperfectly. Some will sound like independence, but beneath it will be an old refusal to trust. Some will appear as low expectations, practical realism, emotional distance, or the habit of staying small so that disappointment feels manageable. The mind becomes very skilled at renaming these patterns in ways that make them easier to keep. But in a moment of true self-observation, the disguise begins to fall away. And what rises to the surface can feel intense, because hidden patterns rarely disappear quietly once they are seen. They begin to reveal their emotional roots. A fear of abandonment, a loyalty to struggle, a belief that love must be earned, a suspicion that ease cannot be trusted, a nervous system that still prepares for loss even in moments of possibility. This is why certain feelings may suddenly intensify when you begin this inner work. Not because something is wrong, but because what has been buried is finally becoming available for release. And the first step in release is accurate recognition. You cannot dissolve what you are still denying. You cannot rewrite what you refuse to name. So the question at this stage is not simply what do I want to become, but what pattern in me keeps recreating what I say I no longer want. What belief still interprets safety as weakness, love as danger, abundance as temporary, rest as laziness, uncertainty as threat. Those are the legacy codes that must be brought into the light. And once they are named, something shifts. They may still be present, but they are no longer invisible. They no longer get to operate with the same authority. The moment you recognize a pattern as inherited conditioning rather than ultimate truth, you loosen its hold on your identity. You stop confusing repetition with destiny. You begin to understand that some of the most powerful changes in a human life do not begin when a person learns something new, but when they finally stop obeying something old. That is the real work here. Not violence against the self. Not shame. Not forcing yourself to become someone else overnight. But clear, courageous discernment. The willingness to say this fear once protected me, but it is no longer the truth I want running my life. This belief once gave me structure, but now it is limiting my future. This emotional reflex once helped me survive, but now it is preventing me from receiving. And in that level of honesty, deletion begins. Not as destruction, but as release. Not as rejection of who you have been, but as a decision to stop letting the past write instructions for a future it cannot imagine. And once the old pattern has been named clearly enough to lose some of its power, the real work begins, because recognition alone does not dissolve what the body has practiced for years. This is the stage where release has to become embodied. Not theatrical, not performative, not forced, but real. Because deep change does not happen when you simply decide that an old fear is no longer welcome. It happens when the system that has been carrying that fear is finally given permission to stop rehearsing it. That is the heart of the dissolution process. You are not trying to attack the old pattern, shame it, or rip it out through willpower. You are creating the internal conditions in which it no longer has the same emotional charge, the same authority, or the same right to keep directing your life. And that begins with one of the most overlooked truths in any inner transformation. The body has to feel what the mind has already understood. Many people reach insight quickly. They can name the pattern, explain where it came from, even describe how it has limited them. But then nothing truly changes, because the body is still bracing the same way, breathing the same way, preparing for the same pain the same way. The nervous system is still loyal to the old map. So the dissolution process is not merely mental. It is a slow unhooking of old associations. It is what happens when fear rises, and, instead of immediately obeying it, you stay present long enough to let the energy move without turning it into another command. It is what happens when you breathe through the contraction rather than building an identity around it. It is what happens when you stop translating every old sensation into proof that the future must repeat the past. In moments like this, breath becomes more than a calming tool. It becomes a signal to the body that the old emergency is no longer in charge. A slower breath interrupts urgency. A longer exhale tells the system that it does not need to mobilize around the same memory again. Presence softens what resistance once kept alive. And with enough repetition, the pattern begins to lose coherence. The emotional reflex that once felt absolute begins to weaken, not because you fought it harder, but because you stopped feeding it with automatic agreement. This is also why release often feels strangely empty at first. People expect liberation to feel dramatic, but very often it feels like spaciousness. A little less tension where there used to be contraction. A little less certainty around an old fear. A little more silence where the old inner narrative used to speak constantly. That space matters, because the mind cannot install something new into a system that is still overcrowded with the emotional debris of what came before. There has to be room. There has to be an inner clearing. And that clearing happens when you consciously stop rehearsing what no longer belongs to your future. You stop energizing the same suspicion, the same inner defense, the same emotional prediction. You stop treating an inherited reaction as if it must remain your truth. In that sense, dissolution is not destruction. It is neutralization. It is the gradual removal of emotional voltage from patterns that once ruled by intensity. And as that voltage lowers, the internal landscape changes. The mind becomes less defensive. The body becomes more available. Resistance stops acting like a permanent wall and starts revealing itself as something that can soften. This is why this stage matters so much. Before anything new can be anchored, the internal field has to become less crowded by the old commands. You are preparing space. You are clearing noise. You are making it possible for the next instruction to land somewhere deeper than surface motivation. And perhaps the most important lesson here is this. Release is not something you force in one perfect moment. It is something you allow by refusing to keep renewing what you are ready to outgrow. That is how the old script begins to dissolve. Not all at once, not through violence, but through repeated moments of embodied honesty in which the past finally loses its automatic right to speak for the future. And once the inner field has been cleared enough for the old script to loosen its grip, the next step is not to wait and hope that something better will appear on its own. The next step is to write with intention, because the subconscious does not remain empty for long. If you do not give it a new instruction, it will quietly drift back toward whatever was most familiar before. That is why this stage matters so deeply. This is the moment where a person stops being only someone who has released the past and begins becoming someone who can consciously define what comes next. But this new script cannot be built from fantasy alone. It cannot be written from desperation, performance, or the wish to escape yourself. It has to be written from a deeper level of honesty. The question is no longer only what do I want, but who would I have to become internally in order to live inside that reality without betraying it the moment it arrives? That changes everything. Because most people try to install a new future using language their deeper system does not yet trust. They speak in outcomes before they speak in embodiment. They say abundance while still practicing tension. They say love while still rehearsing guardedness. They say freedom while still organizing their entire nervous system around control. And then they wonder why the new script never takes hold. But the subconscious does not anchor around what sounds impressive. It anchors around what feels believable, lived, and emotionally coherent. So the new script has to be written in a language the body can receive, not in grand declarations disconnected from reality, but in foundational commands that begin restoring internal order. I am safe enough to stop rehearsing old fear. I am allowed to meet life without shrinking first. I can remain open without abandoning myself. I can receive without immediately preparing for loss. I do not have to become someone else to begin living differently. These are not just affirmations in the shallow sense. They are instructions. They are identity-level permissions. They are new organizing principles that tell the deeper mind how to interpret reality differently from this point forward. And what makes this stage so powerful is that the new script is not only cognitive. It becomes embodied through repetition, imagery, sensation, and emotional association. The mind begins to imagine a different way of being, but the body must also experience what that different way feels like. This is why sensory anchoring matters. If you want trust to become more than an idea, the body has to feel what trust feels like in real time. If you want a new self-concept to stabilize, it has to be connected to breath, posture, movement, tone of voice, and the subtle emotional texture of the moments in which you practice it. Otherwise, it remains an inspiring thought floating above an unchanged system. But when a new command is felt, not just spoken, it begins to sink beneath the level of performance. It starts becoming familiar. And familiarity is powerful because the subconscious tends to return to what feels known. This means you are not only declaring a new reality, you are rehearsing its emotional architecture. You are making the future less foreign to your nervous system. You are teaching the deeper layers of self that this version of life is no longer something distant to admire from afar, but something safe enough to inhabit. That is how a new script begins to lock in, not through one dramatic moment, but through a series of honest repetitions in which your inner world stops arguing with the direction you claim to want. And slowly, the identity begins to reorganize. The old emotional posture softens. The old expectations lose authority. A different internal voice starts becoming more believable than the one that ruled before. This is where real change becomes possible, because the subconscious is finally receiving consistent instructions instead of mixed signals. And once those instructions begin settling into the system, reality is no longer being met by the same version of you that entered this process. A different orientation is beginning to form from within. And once a new inner script has been written deeply enough to feel real, the challenge is no longer how to create change in a single powerful moment, but how to protect that change from being erased by the gravity of old repetition. Because the mind has a way of returning to what is familiar, especially when the emotional intensity of a breakthrough begins to fade. A person can have one clear night of insight, one meaningful moment of release, one honest decision to live differently, and still find themselves drifting back toward old reactions simply because those reactions have been practiced longer. This is why the shift must be locked into the nervous system, not as an idea you admire, but as a rhythm you live. Lasting change is never built only in peak moments. It is stabilized in ordinary ones. It is secured in the quiet hours when nobody is watching, when the old self is no longer being dramatically confronted, but is subtly trying to return through habit, through fatigue, through emotional familiarity. What matters then is not intensity, but repetition with awareness. The new script has to be fed often enough that it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like home. That is why integration matters as much as awakening. Many people know how to feel inspired for a day. Fewer know how to turn inspiration into structure. And without structure, even the most profound realization can remain beautiful but temporary. The deeper mind learns through rhythm, through emotional consistency, through repeated evidence that a new way of being is not dangerous, not imaginary, and not disappearing tomorrow. This is where your nightly practice becomes so important, because the final moments before sleep are some of the most impressionable moments in your entire day. The mind is quieter. The identity softens. The noise of the external world loses some of its grip. And what you repeatedly place into that space begins to shape the emotional tone of the days that follow. So each night, before you sleep, sit in stillness for a few minutes without screens, without stimulation, without rushing into unconsciousness. Let your breath slow naturally. Feel the weight of your body where it meets the bed or the chair. Then ask yourself a simple but honest question. What old pattern tried to reclaim me today? Not to judge yourself, not to turn the day into failure, but to notice. Did fear try to speak again? Did urgency return? Did I shrink in a moment where I wanted to stay open? Did I abandon trust and return to control? Once you see it clearly, name it gently. Then ask the second question. Who did I choose to be, even if only for one moment, that felt more aligned with the life I am building? Find one moment of truth from the day, however small. A calmer response, a more open conversation, a pause before reacting, a choice that felt new. Let that moment matter. Stay with it. Breathe it in. Teach your system that this is the direction now. Then, before sleep takes you, repeat a new internal command slowly enough that your body can receive it. I do not return to what I have already outgrown. I allow my mind and body to learn a new way of living. I am becoming safe for the life I say I want. You do not need 10 different sentences. You need one honest instruction, repeated with feeling. Over time, this practice becomes a bridge between insight and embodiment. It tells the deeper mind that the new script is not temporary inspiration. It is the new standard. And as the nights accumulate, something begins to settle. The old reactions may still appear, but they recover less authority. The new identity begins arriving faster. What once felt unnatural starts feeling steady. This is how the shift becomes durable. Not because you never struggle again, but because you no longer let the old pattern write the final sentence. You meet it, you recognize it, and you return, again and again, to the version of yourself you are now training into reality. And now we arrive at the final threshold, the point where everything we have explored stops being theory, stops being inspiration, and becomes a decision. Because every rare moment eventually closes. Every opening and attention, every window of unusual clarity, every season that invites a person to become more conscious than they were before, eventually gives way to ordinary life again. That is why timing matters so much here. The April 2026 lunar alignment, on April 17, 2026, is not important because it magically changes you on its own. It matters because it creates a rare psychological marker, a moment strong enough to interrupt habit, gather emotion, focus attention, and give your inner work a clear point of entry. Without moments like this, people drift. They delay. They promise themselves they will change later, when life is quieter, when they feel more ready, when the circumstances are better. But later is where most transformations go to disappear. And that is the deeper lesson hidden inside everything we have talked about. Change rarely fails because people are incapable of it. Change usually fails because they never fully step into a moment with enough honesty to let it reorganize them. They touch insight, but they do not commit. They recognize the pattern, but they do not interrupt it consistently enough. They feel the possibility of a different life, but then they return to the emotional posture that built the old one. That is why this is not simply about one ritual, one night, or one powerful emotional experience. It is about using a meaningful moment to make a clean internal decision and then proving that decision through the life you live afterward. The April 17th, 2026 lunar alignment matters because it gives your mind something rare and memorable to organize around. It says, "This is the night I stopped negotiating with the script that no longer serves me. This is the night I stopped confusing familiarity with truth. This is the night I chose to stop letting the oldest part of me keep writing instructions for the future." That is what gives a ritual its real power. Not the appearance of mystery, but the force of focused intention meeting a moment you will remember. And what you do with that moment matters far beyond the date itself. Because after the alignment passes, after the sky returns to seeming ordinary, after the emotional intensity softens, you are still the one who has to live with the instructions running inside you. You are still the one who has to notice when the old pattern returns and choose differently. You are still the one who has to protect the new script by practicing it when it is inconvenient, when it is quiet, when no one is applauding your growth. That is the true test of whether something has changed. Not whether you felt something powerful once, but whether you began living from a different center afterward. So the real application of everything in this video is not complicated, but it is demanding. First, choose one old internal command you are no longer willing to live under. Not 10. One sentence that has quietly shaped your reactions for years. Maybe it is, "I will probably be disappointed." Maybe it is, "I have to struggle to deserve anything good." Maybe it is, "I cannot relax until everything is under control." Maybe it is, "If I open up, I will be hurt." Whatever it is, choose the one that most often steals your peace, your courage, or your openness. Then replace it with one new command that is believable enough to practice and strong enough to guide you. Something like, "I can stay open without losing myself." I do not need fear to stay prepared. I am allowed to receive without bracing for loss. I can move slowly and still be safe. Then prove that new sentence to your system in small, repeated ways. Let your body learn it. Let your schedule reflect it. Let your conversations reflect it. Let your choices reflect it. This is how a new inner script becomes real. Not when you admire it, but when you obey it. And here is the deeper truth I want you to carry with you after this video ends. Your future is shaped less by the intensity of a single breakthrough than by the loyalty you give to what you choose after the breakthrough. Anyone can feel change for an hour. Fewer people are willing to become consistent enough to let that hour become an identity. That is why April 17th, 2026 matters. It is not just a date in the sky. It is a line in the sand. A chance to say, "This is where the old script stops receiving unquestioned authority. This is where I stop waiting for the perfect version of me to begin. This is where I become conscious enough to participate in the writing of my own life." If you are serious about that, then I want you to do something simple and clear. In the comments, write this one sentence: "I am no longer living by my old script." Let that be your marker. Let it be your public decision. Let it be the sentence that reminds you, after this day passes, that you were here, you saw clearly, and you chose. And if this message met you at the right time, subscribe to the Inner Code and support the channel so we can keep creating the next deep, meaningful videos for this journey. Your support is what gives this work momentum, and I want to keep building this space with you.